About an hour outside of Kathmandu, I sat in the bamboo-walled church on a cool Saturday in November. To keep the warmth inside, the walls were packed with mud, and the dirt floors were covered with thick carpets. They didn't have any chairs, so we sat on the ground, men on one side and women on the other. It was obvious that the church used its own resources to construct the structure, and the atmosphere was certainly warm and expressive. As I continued to make observations, things began to become a little confused. Here in this village, in a country that clearly rejects Christianity as a Western religion, there was a Christmas tree decorated at the front, complete with lights, tinsel, and a star on top with a banner that was written in English, "Merry Christmas." The worship leaders were leading the small congregation in songs that had clearly been translated from English, with a drum set, an electric guitar, and keyboard complete with microphones and amplification. The style was not at all what I had imagined to be Nepali. Rather, it appeared to be an attempt to reproduce a Western form of church left by well-meaning missionaries. This isn't a unique story, but one that is repeated all around the world. The influence of Western forms of church, particularly in countries that are hostile to Christianity, can place an undesired stumbling block in the paths of those we're trying to reach. Along with entrapments of non-Indigenous musical instruments and linear pedagogical methods, it's difficult for Christianity to shed its Western garb in order to become genuinely indigenous. This form of colonialism risks not only the witness of Christ, but also the lives of believers who are often viewed as servants of a Western religious agenda. Our need is for a model of the church that is respective of both the culture and Scripture. Most would agree that the colonial era in South America and Africa and Asia did see remarkable change. However, such change was often at the expense of the cultures where colonial powers settled. The hallmarks of colonialism were summarized with 3 C's: commerce, civilization, and Christianity. The historian Stephen Neal equated the colonial agenda with the view that Europeans impoverished and exploited indigenous people who were believed to be inferior and weak. In a very real sense, colonialism saw the need to help people who were deficient in their abilities to help themselves in ways consonant with a colonial worldview. Due to the desire of colonial powers to expand their wealth, commerce became a key means of securing future financial sustainability. As the British missionary statesman Thomas Fowle Buxton believed, the Bible should go hand in hand with commerce. His watchword, "the Bible and plow," set an expectation that along with the gospel came a concomitant financial advantage. The colonial agenda was very much about seeing commercial gain, more for the respective colonial power, but also to a lesser degree for some who became the elite in the cultures that were colonized. Civilization during the colonial powers' agenda in South America, Africa, and Asia was naturally defined by European civil society. Educational and health institutions were classic examples of the definition of civilization, in addition to governmental systems and geopolitical boundaries. For the people of a colonial power to be civilized, it meant that they would look like Europeans. This often meant the shedding of cultural particularities and replacing them with those of Europe. Instead of unique cultural expressions of ethnic groups, people took on the European systems and styles. Most evident in dress, people shed their ethnic garb for trousers and shirts and dresses. Education now focused on the liberal arts and away from traditional knowledge, which was considered inferior to science and technology. Healthcare relied on medicine rather than traditional healing. While not all bad, it left continents with systems that were not indigenous and difficult to maintain once the colonial powers left. In some cases, education, for example, the colonial systems have continued with the typical rote methods of teaching, in spite of the fact that Western teaching methods have progressed due to a greater understanding of effective learning. With a new awareness of oral learning for the majority world, attention is rightly directed to the most effective ways of learning based on cultural preferences. The unfortunate consequence of commerce and civilization was a view that Christianity is a Western religion imposed on communities by colonial powers. Christianity in many former colonial countries is a foreigner's faith, as it's had its own ideas of how Christianity should be expressed. Proper Christianity for Protestants was European or American, and although Protestant churches were more often conducted in the vernacular, liturgically, the church expressed itself as any service one might walk into in Europe or the United States. In spite of the three-self church idea emerging in the late 19th century, churches still looked Western. While leadership, ministry, and finances would eventually be indigenous in some cases, expressions of Christianity remained foreign, as well as systems of theology. Traditional music and instruments, mistakenly thought to be connected to the heathen religions, were replaced by organs. In the contemporary climate, organs have now been replaced with drum sets and electric guitars and pianos and amplification systems, similar to what I observed in Nepal. In a Ugandan village near Lake Victoria, I stood in wonder inside a red brick church as three men played three different types of drums. The worship was expressive and dynamic as the congregation danced around the building in praise to God. It was an emotionally moving experience to see a people express their love for God that was clearly a part of their cultural heritage. After the service, the pastor came to me and apologized. To him and to many clergy around the world, a service needed amplification along with a drum set and guitars and electric keyboard. He was hopeful that they would soon have electricity so that they could have what he thought was a proper church service. Even though we've long passed the colonial period, remnants of those past days still threaten the advancement of the gospel. In place of colonialism, globalization, as well as Western systems, political, commercial, and ecclesiastical, have been established, and while the systems are led by nationals, the new national systems act in a similar way as the colonial powers. This neo-colonialism continues to advance its own contemporary ideas of commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Whereas we can celebrate the demise of colonialism, the threat of a neo-colonial power, particularly on indigenous people groups and rural villages, is just as real as it was 200 years ago. And so the 5-self model, this framework to determine cultural indigeneity, is a framework that places a buffer between the Western expression of Christianity and a non-Western community. Indigeneity can be measured in many ways. Traditionally, the 3-self model was touted as an early attempt to express the characteristics of an indigenous church. Supported by the work of Rufus Anderson and Henry Venn around the turn of the 20th century, they argued that a church would identify with a culture when it had its own leadership, that is, it's self-governing, that it reached out to the community, that is, it was self-propagating, and it provided its own financial resources, that is, it was self-funding. While the 3-self church structure did help new churches become sustainable, it didn't effectively address the issues of expression and theology. Later in the 20th century, the South African missiologist David Bosch suggested that the church needed a 4th self, self-theologizing. It was when a national church began to develop its own theology, according to Bosch, that it would genuinely become indigenous. However, as we continue into the 21st century, churches around the world, no matter if they are Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, carry on their own particular liturgical and worship traditions to such a degree that the churches don't express their own rich cultural heritage. So to adjust for this global observation, a 5th self, self-expression, is focused on adapting cultural forms in contextually biblical ways that identify the church with the culture. The goal of church planting is indigeneity. The church is indigenous when it meets 5 criteria: leadership, multiplication, teaching, financing, and expression. The 5 Self framework encourages a congregation to rely upon its own resources to become sustainable. Having a clear sustainability plan at the beginning of a new church plant provides a greater sense of creating a movement of evangelism and discipleship that will grow exponentially over time. It also requires us to think about systems that are culturally consonant with and conducive to the longevity of the work. The 5 Self model prevents missionaries from setting up structures that can't be sustained by resources of the new church. The church indigeneity matrix is one tool to help determine the level of indigeneity of a church. Based on a 6-point Likert scale, the matrix is a self-assessment tool for churches to evaluate their progress from being a new church plant to becoming a reproducing church that is expressing itself in its particular culture. The Western conformity of the global church runs the risk of creating a church that is homogeneous and without distinct cultural expressions. The beautiful picture that the Apostle John paints for us in Revelation is a church that is identified by the sundry cultures and expressions of worship to the one true Creator God. Distinct languages will be used to worship the King, with the implication that every ethnic group will bring something unique to the throne in recognition of the one who, as John says, quote, was slain. By your blood you ransomed a people to God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you've made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth, end quote. There's a risk of continued resistance to the gospel as ethnic groups desire to preserve their own cultures and view Christianity as a threat because of its Western baggage. The gospel, and by extension the church, is not a Western creation. They are both given by a creative God who has determined the boundaries for all people groups so that they might seek after him and even find him, as Paul tells us in Acts 17. To deny a unique expression of the church in a particular culture is to deny the very uniqueness of us as created in his image.